Hey everyone, welcome to our presentation, Bridging the Gap Between Deficit-Based Systems and the Neurodiversity Movement, Novel Strategies for Changing People's Minds About Neurodivergence. And we are hoping you're ready to play devil's advocate today as we engage in our monster-themed presentation here. First, who are we? Dun, dun, dun. I, Dr. Stacy Greeter, am a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. I see patients in Florida, Washington State, and Colorado, children and adults, and I'm trying to make the world better.
Mm. I'm Allie Bernard Garza. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I live in Colorado and have lived experience of OCD and ADHD. I went 15 years with having my OCD that was severe, undiagnosed, until receiving evidence-based treatment at 25. And that experience changed my life and alongside that, my career. And I am the owner of OCD and Anxiety Colorado, and we provide neurodivergent affirming evidence-based care for adolescents and young adults through our intensive outpatient programs and outpatient services.
Hello, I am Dr. Kim Rust. I am a psychologist who was late diagnosed as autistic. I live in Florida, and I am also authorized to practice in 41 other states under PsyPact. I split my time between doing neurodiversity affirming counseling and evaluations, and I see both as potentially healing processes. I also teach doctoral students in clinical psychology at Fielding University, where I try to bring neurodiversity affirming concepts to the next generation of psychologists.
And hi, I'm Charnel. I am an autistic licensed mental health counselor, and I have a group practice offering mental health counseling exclusively to autistic teens and adults and their families. And we are located in Tampa, Florida.
And I kind of forgot something important in my intro, maybe because it seems so obvious at this point, but I am autistic and ADHD myself. So it takes an average of 17 years for new medical evidence to change prevailing medical practice. What will it take for the neurodiversity paradigm to be widely accepted within medical, academic, culture, and society at large? How do we effectively reach people who are firmly entrenched in a strictly deficit based model, which we're talking about today? Also called a pathologizing perspective of neurodiversity. So, we definitely need greater depth of understanding of autism, yet, we also need to be able to effectively communicate that information to others and then translate it into clinical practice to make the world better for autistic people. This is a photo on the left of Stanford Neurodiversity Summit 2024. And then on the right is the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry 2024, just right around this time last year. I I remember Stanford and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry took a big chance on me because I'm just a psychiatrist in private practice. I haven't published any research since medical school, and I'm not part of a large academic system. I'm not the kind of person who generally gets a platform to speak and be heard. And when I was presenting at the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in 2024, um, we were also the first psychiatrists to present openly autistic ourselves at the ACAP meeting. Um, so I felt like, quite rightfully so, that I wasn't just representing myself at the ACAP meeting, but representing autistic psychiatrists in general, and I didn't want to screw it up. So I consulted a colleague with a lot more experience than me with advocating in academic systems for advice. And what they said to me really stuck with me. They advised me against presenting it all, saying it's far easier to make things worse for autistic doctors than and set us backwards than it is to move things forward. And their concerns were valid because what if when we shared about our personal struggles as autistic physicians, people might think that autistic doctors aren't as good at being doctors. And then any criticism that we had about our medical training and the academic system could make people reject us or turn people off. And also having psychiatry residents presenting as openly autistic is risky for their future career. So it made me think hard about how I show up as an advocate in a way that people will hear me, to help people lean in instead of defensively backing out. How do we effectively change people's minds to make the world better? Which, of course, inspired a very autistic deep dive into this topic and this whole presentation. So that's me as a kid. I'm in the middle, in case you can't find me. Um, as a child, I felt pretty misunderstood and unseen and alone, honestly. And I didn't have much of a voice then. I um, recognized that that same wounded child is speaking up today with you. I need to speak out uh, for other misunderstood and unseen autistic children. I am a wounded advocate. And those same wounds that inspire me so passionately to speak up are also my greatest liabilities as an advocate. So at Stanford's 2024 conference, I was emphasizing over and over again to my co-presenters that we needed to show up not as angry, hurt people criticizing the academic medical training system, but because we didn't want to turn people off to our message. And my colleagues rightfully pointed out to me that if we completely sanitize our message by erasing all anger, we also wouldn't be showing up very authentically. So it's a balancing act. How do we advocates, wounds, flaws, and all show up most effectively to advocate for a more neurodiversity affirming approach to treatment? Allie.
So, in this presentation, we're going to be exploring the barriers that interfere with creating meaningful change. And that includes barriers that not only show up on the individual level, but also within organizations and even larger systems. We're going to look at why it can be so difficult to change people's minds, what we can learn from both social and political science about shifting people's perspectives, and which strategies are the most effective in practice. And then we're going to connect these strategies to the larger systems, whether it's policy or training or education, and talk about how we as advocates can care for ourselves, build community and support, and sustain this work over the long term.
So first, let's start about how misunderstandings of what neurodiversity affirming actually means are a major barrier to a broader adoption of neurodiversity affirming care. The goal of neurodiversity affirming treatment is for the individual to be living their most authentic, fulfilled, meaningful, functional life, not to be as, quote, normal as possible, where autonomy and self determination are central and we value lived experience. It does not mean that lived experience is the only valid form of understanding autism. It does not mean that autistic people don't need any treatment or that we only talk about the good parts of being autistic, which brings us to how traditionally um, the model of autism care that tries to make autistic people appear as normal or neurotypical as possible is usually referred to as the medical model of care. And this can be confusing because medical professionals hearing, oh, the neurodiversity affirming model of care is so much better than the medical model of care, might think that we are anti medical treatment for autistic people. And we really need the medical system as an ally here in adopting neurodiversity affirming care. So I like Zosha Zax's 2023 paper suggesting that medical model could be changed to the make people normal model, normalization model of care. What are some other barriers that are getting in the way of changing people's minds about neurodivergence?
So,
Charnel?
since subjectivity often feels like objectivity, naive realism makes it seem as though the best way to change people's minds is to show them the facts that support your view, because anyone else who has read the things that you have read or seen the things that you have seen will naturally see things your way, given that they've pondered the matter as thoughtfully as you have. Therefore, you assume that anyone who disagrees with your conclusions probably just doesn't have all the facts. If they did, they'd already be seeing the world as you do. So, again, many people intuitively reason that if they give enough information, if they can only explain the facts, that the listener will then be able to accurately reason and come to a rational conclusion. But again, decision making is not as deliberate or logical as we may assume or hope. This is because engaging in slow, deliberate, and rational decision making actually requires cognitive strain. And to avoid this strain, we often engage in subconscious processes called heuristics. You can think of heuristics as mental shortcuts that reduce cognitive strain. They help us to quickly dismiss or argue away new information so that we do not spend the time or cognitive energy integrating new ideas into our current belief system. And this is why our advocacy efforts that look like trying to convince someone of our beliefs by providing them with the information that we have can be very ineffective.
Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt uses the analogy of a rider and an elephant to explain this phenomenon. So, in this example, the rider is our logical reasoning, and he believes that he's in charge, but it's actually the elephant representing our emotional intuition that's driving decision making, especially on moral issues in particular, like human rights. So the elephant, the emotional intuition, nudges in a certain direction, and then the rider, our logical reasoning, makes all kinds of post hoc rationalizations to explain why we believe a certain thing that make our decision making seem rational when we're not being as objective as we think at all.
Yeah, I think the natural urge, especially in clinical or academic settings, is to just keep giving more information, more data, more research. The thought is that if I can explain enough, if I can show enough evidence, that people will understand and therefore change their minds. And that instinct makes sense. I respect it, that facts and data do matter. But here's the challenge is that the more abstract we become, the easier it is for people to feel disconnected. And when that disconnect grows, frustration tends to grow with it, and for both the speaker and the listener. Our goal, of course, is still to gain a mutual understanding, but understanding doesn't live only in the writer, so to say, the rational part of us that analyzes and explains. It also lives in the elephant, the part of us that feels, that's intuitive, and that so often drives the real decisions that we end up making.
So As Ali explained, while info dumping certainly has its place, telling stories that resonate with people emotionally speaks to that elephant, the emotional intuition, and thus can be much more effective. And so to level up even further, in changing people's minds, we need to help people understand why they came to hold a particular belief or opinion and what need does hanging on to that belief serve for them that makes it hard to change.
So it can be very, very difficult for people who have been aligned with a pathologizing model to move to a more neurodiversity affirming approach. In general, people often cling on to their cherished views out of fear that if those are changed, just a vacuum will be left. For example, people may prefer the certainty that the DSM-5 TR is 100% accurate rather than recognizing it as a fallible, socially constructed document that will look really different in 10, 20, or 50 years. People might also fear for their professional relevance. For example, I've seen it said in a number of professional settings, if self-diagnosis is valid, do I still even have a job as a psychologist? So people worry about their professional relevance.
You know, and it hurts to say this, but in medical training, I was taught that autistic people lack theory of mind, struggle with perspective taking and cognitive empathy. And when I accepted that I had been wrong and thinking that autistic people have no theory of mind, as I was taught, I had to also accept that I had caused harm as a psychiatrist to my patients in misunderstanding them and also missing a lot of autism diagnoses, including my own. As a psychiatrist, also, when I changed my belief from what I was taught about autism in residency, will I be judged by other psychiatrists as a bad psychiatrist who just sees autism diagnoses everywhere? Which brings us to another major point. Sociologist Brooke Harrington coined the concept social death, that is, rejection from one's social community, is greater than physical death. Evolutionary psychology plays into this because we, as cavemen, if you fell down and you broke your femur and people didn't like you, and no one would take care of you, you would die. So you could literally die of being unpopular, and thus avoiding social rejection is a survival instinct encoded in our DNA. When you're rejected from your community, your brain literally thinks you are dying. And personally, I hypothesize that artistic people are often less susceptible to this cognitive bias than neurotypical people, as many autistics will be more willing to prioritize accuracy and what is right over social safety, which got me into a lot of trouble growing up, certainly. But Julia Galef, who is the co founder of the Center for Applied Rationality, notes hold your identities lightly. The degree to which people feel the certainty about a belief when confronted with contradictory data is directly proportional to degree to which they identify as belonging to a particular group of people who holds that same belief. So, for example, let's say believing the social model of disability solidifies my membership in a community of disability rights advocates. If I identify myself as a disability rights advocate, it's going to be harder for me to objectively question the social model of disability. And then if I start wondering to myself, are all forms of disability really due to societal barriers? Then I may risk losing my membership in the disability rights community, and my identity as an advocate may be threatened. Perhaps I'm not a good disability rights advocate if I experience being autistic myself as both a disability in some situations and an advantage in others, how safe is it to me for me to express these ideas on my social media group without getting ousted from my favorite Facebook groups? So, what do people risk losing by changing their minds?
Yeah, and this is a central question to really assess and think about what people do risk when they change their minds. From the outside, they can seem like fixed beliefs are just a matter of stubbornness, but often the real issue is cost. Changing one's mind isn't just intellectual, it can carry social, emotional, and even existential consequences. Sometimes those risks are more subtle, like a hit to credibility, a strained friendship, or just discomfort or uncertainty in and of itself. But at the other end of the spectrum, for example, in high control environments like specific, certain religious systems or cults, those costs escalate quickly. Questioning one's belief can topple the whole structure, leading to profound loss of safety, community, relationships, and even one's identity. At the very launch of my own young adulthood, I left a high control religious cult. And for me, it was not just about changing opinions. It meant exile and having to rebuild my life from the ground up. Living through that experience showed me just how high the cost of shifting beliefs can be and how fear itself often becomes the greatest barrier to change. Most don't face such severe consequences, or at least I would hope, but that same dynamic exists on a spectrum. Whatever the cost is, whether it's subtle or devastating, the underlying fear remains. If I change my mind, will I still belong? Will I be safe? Will I still know who I am? And this is why understanding the potential loss that's at play matters. Facts and evidence rarely change minds if the social or existential cost feels too high. But when we're able to recognize what's truly at stake for folks, we can explore conditions of safety and belonging that hopefully can lower that risk and make change possible.
So, a challenge we are also facing is an increasingly wider gap between our polarizing beliefs. This is a result of something called the law of group polarization, which says that groups that form over shared attitudes tend to become more adamant and polarized over time. When I learned about this, it really had me understanding the impact that social media is having on our capacity to engage in meaningful discussions with people of varying beliefs and how this was increasingly polarizing different groups of people. On social media, we are finding ourselves in more and more groups formed by shared attitudes. So we are actively engaging with fewer people with outside perspectives or with opposing beliefs. It is clear, too, to most in the group that if you disagree with the group, you will be silenced or kicked out. It really reinforces something called cultural cognition, which means that if a person disagrees with the group, they do not speak up because they value being accepted by the group more than being accurate. And being ever more consistently exposed to those that share in our beliefs reinforces confirmation bias, as there are fewer contrarian beliefs in our immediate networks.
So, this is why we need non judgmental dialogue, helping families and professionals be more open to more neurodiversity affirming strategies for autistic kids than traditional compliance oriented ABA is a big part of my advocacy work on a routine basis. And the original research supporting ABA has significant flaws necessitating further study. Many autistic people have spoken about how they were harmed when undergoing behavioral treatments that prioritize compliance, or appearing as neurotypical as possible over quality of life. And some examples include training autistics to suppress their own needs or mistrust themselves, masking autistic traits to please others. However, some behavioral tools, such as positive reinforcement, modeling by breaking down a new behavior into smaller steps, or modifying the antecedents of a challenging behavior by adjusting the environment can be extremely helpful strategies as part of treatment plans that prioritize autonomy, self efficacy, and authenticity. To better serve the needs of autistic people, we need to be having, and their families, by the way, we need to be having open, curious, non judgmental dialogue about people's experiences with ABA and other treatments for autistic people without shaming people. It's understandable when social justice groups um, want to close themselves off and have their own safe spaces where everyone in the group agrees with them that ABA is abusive, or everyone in the group agrees with them that ABA is helpful. And that serves a valuable purpose for those people. However, that doesn't translate to effective advocacy work in which the goal is to reach other people outside the group and welcome them in. For someone to change their mind, they have to be feeling welcome and respected in your group.
So, in my role as a counselor, I've met with parents whom I recognized were hesitant to share that they had used ABA in the past or that they had found it actually helpful for their child. I've started to wonder what that says about myself as an advocate of the neurodiversity movement if the parents of my clients do not feel comfortable sharing with me significant information from their child's past.
I actually move in a, as you may guess, in a lot of neurodiversity affirming circles. But because of that, I've been hesitant to share that we used ABA with our son at sometimes when he was little. And this is one of the ways that the gap widens. In our family's case, we found brief ABA really helpful to figure out why our toddler, Quinn, one of my favorite people in the world, was having meltdowns nearly every day when it was time to get dressed for preschool. And like Stacy mentioned above, we realized that the antecedent to this pattern, which was emotionally draining for both me as a mom and for him, was letting him play with toys while I did the breakfast dishes, and then expecting him to transition to the much, much less preferred activity of getting dressed. You know, motor skills and things like that were hard for him. So even though I was helping him, getting dressed was really frustrating. And once we switched the order around, we would first get him dressed and then allow him to play while I did the dishes. He was such a happier boy, and we were able to start the day without meltdowns. However, this is something that I hesitate to share in certain circles due to fear of being ostracized for even using ABA services.
So, bringing us to another question of how do we prevent the alienation of families of autistics with high support needs? So maybe some of you are aware there is a subset, not all parents, a subset of parents of autistics with high support needs who feel extremely unseen by the neurodiversity movement. In a very autistic move, I decided to go online to ask these parents of high support need autistics who are upset with the neurodiversity movement, how can we do better? Um, I went on and said, hey, I'm doing a presentation, guys. What would you love for me to share that people aren't talking about enough, that you want the neurodiversity movement to know about your experience? And thus managed to get myself invited into various autism mom groups. Uh, the one group that particularly made an impression on me was Profound Autism Allies. Parents spoke of feeling erased by the neurodiversity movement, that when advocates like myself speak out saying autism is a difference, not a disorder, their very real pain and suffering feels ignored. That as I speak about autonomy and autistic identity, they're more concerned about their kid eloping from the classroom or smearing feces on the wall. And when I use the word autistic, to describe my lived experience. Parents feel that I co opted that term, autism, to describe something, an extremely different condition than the one impacting their children with high support needs. One mother of an autistic son with severe apraxia who cannot use mouth words typed, "My son doesn't want acceptance. He wants a cure. He wants to be able to wipe his own bottom." These particular parents, which of course are not representing all parents of high support need autistics, felt judged by the neurodiversity social justice movement, and that advocates of neurodiversity are just out of touch with their experience. And this is another gap that we need to be bridging.
So right now, there are no models within our neurodiversity community on how we can highly effectively advocate to shift the minds of our clients, their families, and of other medical professionals away from the deficit-based lens. However, we can use insights gathered from other effective advocacy models and apply them to our own efforts. I'd like to speak to a model called deep canvassing. Deep canvassing was developed at the Leadership Lab, Learn, Act, Build, the political action arm of the Los Angeles LGBT Center. And one of the lab's core missions was to change people's beliefs about gay marriage. The lab, through its advocacy work, discovered this process they identified again as deep canvassing. So, deep canvassing differs from traditional canvassing in that it focuses on personal storytelling, empathy, slowing thinking, and on eliciting perspective taking. What does this look like? So, it starts with non judgmental engagement, meaning the canvasser respectfully and non judgmentally asks the person's opinion on a specific issue. Then the canvasser invites the person to explain why or how they have come to their belief and encourages them to recall a time in their life when they themselves felt judged, discriminated against, or unfairly treated. At this point, the canvasser is helping the individual access emotional experiences that form a bridge to perspective taking or understanding others. The canvasser then draws parallels between the person's experience and the experience of those facing systemic stigma. This critical step encourages the person to see the issue through a lens of shared humanity, cultivating a shift in their perspective. Research by Brookman and Kalla in both 2016 and 2020 found deep canvassing to be highly effective when used to target transgender prejudice. They concluded that the effects were large and long lasting as well, with increased positivity present even 3 months after the initial deep canvassing conversation. And it is important to note that each deep canvassing conversation lasted just 10 minutes. What Brookman and Kalla's research offers for us is that if we use the deep canvassing model within our own conversations, we too can increase openness and we can help people to let go of beliefs that are incongruent to what they actually know.
So, in this model, we want to be evoking from the other person instead of just inputting information about our beliefs. We're eliciting their reasons for a belief, encouraging self reflection, and what we in psychiatry like to call mentalization, thinking about their thinking. So let's say I want to convince other psychiatrists that autistic people really do have theory of mind and perspective taking abilities. I might start by asking questions about how that psychiatrist came to learn that autistic people lack theory of mind. I find common ground, perhaps, in wanting to help autistic people. Perhaps I share a personal story of how I used to believe incorrect things about autism myself and came to update my beliefs with new information. The goal here is cultivating openness, curiosity, and welcoming disagreement and avoiding triggering defensiveness. Defensiveness happens when the other person perceives there's a threat of judgment towards them. Psychologist Louis Casolino writes about becoming a amygdala whisperer, amygdala being the fear center of the brain. So we put people at ease and avoid defensive tripwires. This pans out in studies too, because Kaplan's 2016 study of the neural correlates of people maintaining or changing their political beliefs when faced with counter evidence showed that people with less activation of their amygdala were the ones more receptive to changing their political stance on an issue. In psychiatry, I have always seen that we often need to listen more than we speak. So, approaching someone across the divide as a fellow explorer with us instead of being the expert talking down to them. Let's start normalizing making mistakes. And that as practitioners, we are constantly updating our clinical practice. So I'm always sharing very publicly with my fellow psychiatrists how many autism diagnoses I missed back in the day, including my own. And this recognition of an error and then updating our prior assumptions to pivot in a new direction is something to celebrate in our field. Leading with vulnerability helps invite other people to self reflect and lessens shame. So you might notice that today I started this presentation telling a story about my personal insecurities as an advocate. Humor and playfulness also help people tolerate the discomfort of controversial topics and to connect with us as more human. I have on our YouTube channel a Little Mermaid presentation of autism empowerment, which is a fictional story to keep the audience within their realm of tolerance while exploring uncomfortable topics and give people characters to relate to, which lets us go deeper without lighting up the other person's amygdala.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of getting to serve as an advocate with the International OCD Foundation. And through that work, it's reinforced the belief that I have that lived experience is one of the most authentic ways that we can bridge the gap between professional knowledge and true understanding and change. That's why I share about my lived experience as a clinician and as someone who's navigated debilitating OCD and around taboo content that can feel really scary to share about because of the devastating impact that I've had of stigma on my own life. And I do that because my hope is that stories, including my own, can create impact where data alone often cannot. Also to lessen shame and deepen empathy and open space for change. In that process, we move away, like Stacey was saying, from positioning ourselves as the sole experts, instead step into the role of partners walking alongside each other for the journey.
So, for another example of an approach that can get people to really hear each other, Kirk Schneider talks in his book, The Depolarizing of America, a guidebook for social change. He talks about the way that fear keeps people from wanting to change. Essentially, fear drives polarization by fostering black and white and us versus them thinking. And as he puts it, fear tells us if we can stick with what's familiar and routine, we'll be okay. He suggests that we need to remember that we're dealing with myths, not absolute truths. And he has two programs, one for groups and one which involves one-on-one discussions. In both settings, people are asked to focus on walking in the other person's shoes and really listening to their stories, not changing their minds. People are also asked to speak only for themselves, not for any other person or any group. The key to this is abandoning expectations that participants will change each other's minds or views. And after sharing their stories, the talk concludes with what, if anything, they learned from each other, and if there is a prospect for common ground or action. And the larger goal is to find a way to renew colleagueship, which is definitely our goal in this talk as well. Now we're going to look a little bit and reflect on our professional training and education and how we are molded and shaped by this process. Um, Next slide. I think. Thank you. And then the next one. Yeah. Cool. The current educational model is one that fits with Pablo Freire's notion of the banking approach to education. So in this approach, we have this concept that we fill the students' minds with information which is considered true knowledge. However, this knowledge actually reflects the values of the dominant society. And in our purposes for this talk, it's the pathologizing model of autism that's kind of underlying the message that we're getting in our education. In this banking model, students are not really taught to think critically. Rather, as it has been described by Hoffman and Clear Hoffman, these psychologically educated professionals then rely on this acquired knowledge and impose a values system on clients. So we do this sometimes without even thinking about it. However, an alternative to this would be Charles Sanders Peirce proposed the notion of fallibilism. He suggested that no belief is beyond revision because our knowledge is always incomplete. He also emphasized the importance of the communal nature of scientific understanding, so we really, really need to keep listening and learning from each other. He also emphasized that this approach is something, I'm sorry, I would say, not him, that this is the approach we should be taking in general in terms of autism and diagnoses. We need to be looking at our knowledge as incomplete and that there's always more to learn. This open-minded and ever-questioning approach is in sharp contrast to Freire's banking notion of education.
So I have a story. When I was in my child psychiatry fellowship, I remember there was some controversy because different people had very different definitions of what did or did not constitute pediatric bipolar disorder. So me, um, in my, mission to try to figure this out, I would take the same patient case, on the fence of what could that be considered a manic episode? Could that be considered pediatric bipolar? Really? And I would ask the same question of uh, all the different attendings that I came in contact with. And they realized I was doing this and took great offense. I actually uh, was given quote remedial action where I was had to switch, not be able to switch between attendings anymore, and just stick with the same attending as a supervisor on an ongoing basis, because they said I was shopping around for different answers in my very autistic um, mission to try to collate as many answers as possible into figuring out how the heck to help my young patients. So it makes me reflect. And I think that, unfortunately, we need to wonder how safe it is in your academic training to be wrong. And then if it is unsafe during your training, how will you experience it as safe to be wrong during the rest of your career? Um, were you encouraged to openly and respectfully disagree during your training? And then given those tools to do that later? Was the subjectivity of clinical practice and diagnosis and the existence of multiple perspectives, and treatment strategies highlighted, or was that seen as a threat? So, in Julie Galef's book, The Scout Mindset: Why Some People See Things Clearly and Others Don't, she describes two modes of thinking: a scout, whose goal is to constantly refine an accurate map of reality, and a soldier, whose goal is to defend their existing map. Ideally, we want training programs to cultivate a scout mindset in our learners and acknowledge that being wrong is celebrated when unbiased truth seeking is the goal, even when it's uncomfortable. Gayla's book resonated with me a lot because I am constantly telling my medical residents, stay curious and to cultivate a place of extreme non defensiveness as they interact with their patients and colleagues, so they can celebrate when they discover they've been wrong. And we also need some banking approach to be going on too, because we need more training programs to include neurodiversity affirming information about autism and just basic information about autism, period, in the training. And we need professional institutions to publish and highlight neurodiversity affirming information, which brings us to another gap: the gap between the research world and clinical practice. And as I mentioned, some academic conferences like Stanford and ACAP took a big chance on me being a private practice psychiatrist who's not part of the academic medical center world. So, and yet, I find people who are in clinical practice, who are integrally exposed on a daily basis to their clients' lived experiences, have so much to offer the research world. And the research world, of course, has a lot to offer us in clinical practice. So this is another bridge that another gap, sorry, that we need to work on bridging. So thank you. You know, I had mentors, Dr. Joshua Fader in this photo, Dr. Lawrence Fung, Allie.
Yeah, some of the strongest allies that I've found have actually come from outside of the mental health field. So whether these are educators, business leaders, journalists, these unlikely allies, so to say, bring fresh perspectives, influence, and resources that strengthen our collective work. And they also bring their own stories, often of a loved one who has struggled, or an experience that has reshaped how they see the world. It makes me think about my own parents, who had no personal lived experience or professional experience with mental illness, and yet through raising me and walking alongside me, became strong allies and advocates, not only for myself, but also for others who are facing similar challenges. What I've learned is that allyship doesn't grow from persuasion, but from connection. And the goal isn't to change someone's mind in a single conversation, but to sit in good faith and listen, share, and walk briefly in each other's shoes.
And Allie, that is the work of advocacy, yes. Um, as we think about changing the world for the better, we need to not just be advocating, but also actively recruiting and mentoring new potential advocates to pass the torch to. This is so critical, especially given the personal toll of advocacy work. I think about how being autistic makes me both particularly well suited for advocacy work. I mean, I love speaking up for the underdog. I love compiling, collecting, presenting, and dumping information. I'm particularly passionate about different perspectives, and also that passion and those wounds make me particularly vulnerable as an advocate, especially to the personal impact that it has. Um, I've heard all the things on this slide, and at the very bottom is a screenshot that I took actually of feedback that I got after a presentation on autism I gave at a pediatric hospital where, they're like, of course, this speaker is not autistic. Doesn't make any sense. And um, rejection, sensitivity, dysphoria definitely plays a role. Um, Having been misunderstood and not heard as a child makes it really tough when I'm not able to reach people again doing my advocacy work as well. And that brings up a good point about how we sustain ourselves in this work. Kim.
Additional challenges that could make being an advocate even more of a toll on autistic individuals include trauma and social justice sensitivity. Quentin et al. Did a systematic review of 18 studies, and they found the rates of trauma, or I'm using that like big T trauma, PTSD, to be at the same level or higher than in the non-autistic population of children and adults that they were looking at. However, they did also find that the rates of severity, the clinical severity was higher for autistic individuals in terms of trauma. As such, neurodivergent providers may be particularly susceptible to vicarious trauma when advocating for client needs or when being dismissed or invalidated when trying to present an affirming viewpoint in a non-receptive professional environment. Um, Social justice sensitivity has been defined as a heightened sense of fairness, equity, and inclusion, as well as the need to address and correct injustices. Neurodivergent individuals can be driven by justice sensitivity and can be fearless advocates. In fact, a qualitative study published in 2020 by Dempsey et al. Showed that autistic individuals will often choose to do what is right over what is easy, such as focusing on fairness and equity and disregarding appeals to authority. Further, if an advocate has justice sensitivity, they may struggle to take breaks or set work-life boundaries, which can, put them at greater risk of burnout.
Feel called out. Allie.
Yeah. Advocacy, especially in mental health, justice, or identity-based spaces, especially when these are our own identities, can feel extraordinarily heavy, especially when we carry it alone. And when one person shoulders it all or tries to, advocacy can feel impossible. And that's why we need to build connections, and together through connection and collaboration and belonging, the hope is that the weight becomes lighter, even as the challenges ahead of us remain. Collaboration can make advocacy stronger and more inclusive and more powerful when many voices and resources come together. Self-reflection is what keeps us grounded in our values and helps us act with integrity instead of being driven only by urgency or anger. And just as important is self-preservation. I like to say you can only die on so many hills, but that yet so many of us want to try to die on many of them, if not all. And that's where it's going back to remembering that this is not a sprint. It's a lifelong journey. There are going to be many hills ahead. And rest is not weakness. Again, called out. As I say it,
Yeah, you
I
sound like
have
my
to remind
therapist,
myself.
Allie, right now.
And the daily conversation I have with myself, that boundaries are not selfish. And that's what's going to create endurance across the work that we do. Advocacy is heavy, especially when it's centered around our own lived experiences or the ones that are of people who are close to us. And that's where when we do it together, it not only becomes bearable, but becomes transformative and sometimes fun. Hence, Stacy in the front there, wings out and everything. And in a way that, yeah, we could just never do it alone.
So grateful to my fellow neurodivergent ambassadors here. Um, so I will let you know that the notes that we made for this last slide were Stacy says something wise. And I realized I didn't really have anything wise to say on the last slide. And it makes sense because I need to do less talking and just start listening more. Um, I just am here with a lot of gratefulness in my heart towards these amazing people I've gotten to learn from here doing this presentation and learn with, and those who've mentored and taught me. And I plan to pay it forward um, by teaching others to be advocates. Um, I want to keep deepening my understanding of other people's perspectives that are different from mine, keep making mistakes, of course. So I look forward to finding out what I'm wrong about next.
Ooh.